lighting better. That's good. Here we go.
Okay, and we are recording.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. I am Kristen Kansiewicz. I'm a doctoral candidate at Regent University in the Counselor Education and Supervision program. And my co-presenter, Michelle Caulk, is also a doctoral candidate in the same program. We are cohort buddies. And we are going to present today on safer spaces, stigma reduction in church settings. So we both have worked in church settings and we can introduce ourselves. So I'll start. I'm up in the Boston area and I have been working in a church setting, basically embedding clinical mental health counseling into my church. And I've been working on this for the last 15 years on my own. And then in the last couple of years have started a nonprofit to expand and have other churches where student counseling, master's level counseling students can do their internships in church settings as well, with the covering of a nonprofit agency that provides counseling services. So that way have a little more oversight and we're able to follow kind of all the state regulations that any one individual church might not be able to do. So that's my work in a nutshell. Michelle, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm in the St. Louis, Missouri area now. Moved up here in August after spending about 14 years in Tampa, Florida. And it was in Tampa that I partnered with a local church to establish a counseling center under the auspices of the church, but still a private practice model. And so really have a heart for helping as Kristen does, helping churches and faith organizations establish a mental health care community of practice within underneath their roofs. And while this has been kind of starting over here in St. Louis, I hope that this will be a part of the way that I can contribute to the community again. So really excited to share with you our presentation today and get your thoughts and feedback. Hopefully we've got some time for that. And hopefully this stimulates thinking for you within your own faith communities as you're considering setting up some sort of stigma challenging or mental health services within your particular community. So that's who we are. And if you would like to take a moment and just briefly say who you are and where you're located, and in the chat box, that would be fantastic. And then Kristen is going to talk a little bit about why this topic matters and what our learning objectives are.
Yeah, great. And by the way, if you also have a website or anything like that that you want to put in the chat, that's great for networking. So happy to have you self-promote in there so we can get to know you. And also, Michelle has posted in the chat the website churchtherapy.com. That's my website. And if you go to churchtherapy.com/stigma, all of the slides for today, as well as an ideas worksheet, and some resources that I've created are all clickable links in there. So if you want to kind of follow along or just bookmark that page, then you'll have all the resources from our talk today. So this topic matters ultimately because faith communities often have some extra barriers and extra stigma around mental health issues. And we're going to talk specifically about what some of those are a little bit later. But really we want to think about the ways in which stigma impacts faith communities and the ways we can overcome that. Because in some ways, faith communities are perfectly set up to kind of address stigma in a variety of ways. And so in our experiences and in other churches that we've known, we've really been able to overcome that and decrease stigma in really significant ways. So that's our passion and our learning objectives for this hour. Are first to identify subconscious mental illness stigma biases within ourselves. Even though we're counselors and maybe we'd like to think that we don't carry any stigma or biases, we do because we're human. And so we want to kind of sit with ourselves around that a little bit. We want to understand the two types of stigma, self-stigma and public stigma, which we'll talk about, and their social and economic and spiritual implications. We're going to discuss evidence-based therapeutic strategies that counselors can use for self-stigma reduction. And these are ideas that really we could build on and learn from and use in our practice and also in church settings. And then we're going to apply leading stigma reduction research to create strategies that can be implemented by counselors or lay leaders within church settings. So those are our goals. And we're going to start off with a visualization exercise. And so you can just kind of maybe close your eyes or take a minute to picture someone who's mentally ill. Just what mental picture comes to mind when you think of someone who's mentally ill? Now, I use that language very specifically because normally we would not use that language. It's not a more politically correct language of a person with a mental health disorder or a person with a mental illness. And so I use that evocatively and on purpose to say, you know, when you think of someone who's mentally ill, when we've done this exercise before, and you can type what you might have in mind in the chat. We didn't want to open it up for discussion too early because then we'll probably run out of time, but just in the chat, if you kind of imagine, type what you imagine, if you feel comfortable doing that. A lot of times when we've done this, I've used this visualization exercise before, people often immediately picture someone who's homeless or someone who is disheveled, out of touch with reality, kind of the more extreme versions of mental health disorders, in addition to poverty that may or may not indicate a mental illness. And I just want you to kind of sit with whatever came up for you when the thought first popped into your mind, because that really can help us understand stigma that we may carry. Most of the time we don't picture, if we think of someone who's mentally ill, we don't picture our coworker or our fellow church member who seems on the outside pretty okay, but actually dealing with depression or anxiety and we just don't know. And so we wanted to kind of point that out, just begin and say sometimes when we're talking about mental illness, we automatically go to the more severe forms of mental illness. And what that does, particularly in faith communities, is cause us to overlook 25% of our church members who may be struggling with more mild or hidden forms of mental illness. So that's just something to keep in mind. And now Michelle is going to take it away about what is stigma.
A quick definition of stigma, the dictionary definition of it is that it's a mark of disgrace, and that's very strong language, but associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or a particular person. Synonyms around that, which of course have negative connotations, are shame, disgrace, dishonor. So that's what we're talking a little bit about today. And people who are labeled as mentally ill, regardless of the diagnosis or level of disability, they are stigmatized more severely than those with other health conditions. The general public seems to infer who has a mental illness and maybe who doesn't, based on 4 cues. And those 4 cues are psychiatric symptoms, so what they can see the person is exhibiting, social skills deficits, physical appearance, and then labels. And so like Kristen's example was, they may see a person and think that unkempt person who's talking to themselves, sitting on a park bench in the middle of a Tuesday morning, must have mental problems. And so we look at all of those different cues and they add up to a particular vision of a person. And so there's some interesting research around this about what else kind of contributes to stigma. And Feldman and Crandall from 2007, they explain it through 3 contributing factors: responsibility, danger, and rarity. And so the first one is responsibility, which is the degree to which people perceive that an individual is at fault for his or her illness. the higher the attribution of responsibility, the more negative that thought outcome, including feelings of anger and avoidance and lower levels of sympathy. So if they perceive the person to be responsible for their mental illness, they're not going to have a lot of empathy for that particular person. The second one is danger, which is the extent to which people believe that a person with mental illness poses a threat. And so how much are they a danger to myself personally and then society as a whole? The more dangerous the person is perceived to be, of course, the more that people are willing to reject or avoid the individual. And so the third one is rarity, which is the degree to which people believe that the mental disorder is uncommon. Interestingly enough, one study talked about that the participants perceive rare conditions to be more severe, which is actually a misconception, as we know, because we're in the field. And then the last one is attribution theory by Corrigan. It's one of several social cognitive approaches to explaining or defining stigma. And they frame it in terms of knowledge structures. And so we create these knowledge structures as efficient means of categorizing people into groups. And so when we talk about stigma and mental illness, we efficiently categorize certain stereotyped people into either the out group, so that's mental illness, and then the rest of us who do not have mental illness into the in group. And so then after creating that kind of efficient knowledge structure of in group and out group, then we assign attribution or blame to the out group of those with mental illness. And that leads, of course, to specific feelings that fuel the stigma, which is fear, pity, and maybe even some anger. Okay, so we'll go on to this idea of public versus self-stigma. So it's not even just how the public categorizes or stigmatizes mental illness, but then there's also a part that we need to recognize where those with mental illness take on a self-stigma. And this is from further research by Corrigan. And so stigmas, starting there on the left-hand side, they are cues. We talked about those four kind of cues that elicit stereotypes, and particular stereotypes about the mentally ill. Of course, they include violence, incompetence, blame, for example. I'm sure you can think of quite a few more. And the way that these are intertwined then, so when the stereotype is endorsed, then that leads to prejudice, which is a little bit deeper. That is really the deeper belief system or the core belief. And then that prejudice leads to negative emotions about the group. So all mentally ill people, again, that efficiency of categorizing, all mentally ill people are scary. And then the prejudice, which is, it's both a cognitive and an affective response, then that leads to discrimination, which is a behavioral response. So what do we do with this prejudice that all mentally ill people are scary? So if both the stereotype and the belief system are believed to be true, then there's a negative outcome or a negative action to the outgroup. So for example, employers won't hire somebody with a history of mental illness if they hold the stereotype and then the prejudice. And then on the right-hand side is what happens when the public stigma becomes internalized. We live in a culture that is just steeped in stigmatizing images. Not only of just those with mental illness, but of course of any walks of life. But a person with mental illness might accept these and then suffer the consequences, which are diminished self-esteem, diminished self-efficacy, and a negativity towards what's possible in their future. Essentially, they believe that they are less than, so they've taken on the public stigma. Interestingly, families, of course, may also take on some of the public stigma and turn it into a private stigma. And they report a higher sense of secondary shame as a result of the family member's mental illness. So what's the harm of stigma? If I haven't convinced you already that it's a really, really bad thing, we get to talk a little bit about the harm of stigma before we go on to some of the good possibilities that Kristen gets to talk about what we do with stigma. And so with all of the public and self-stigma, of course, people are more likely to avoid being labeled with a mental illness. This allows them to essentially escape all of the negative statements that would lessen self-esteem, that would affect their families, and decrease self-efficacy. Certainly in societies where family cohesion is of great importance, this effect of stigma by association can be much more severe, causing economic consequences, even for the other family members, even, marriage prospects, work prospects. And so it's not just the individual that feels the stigma, it's certainly the others. And so people may not seek treatment because they're aware of the negative outcome that it could have on family. Interestingly, several studies have talked about how stigma contributes to decreased care when they are able to obtain it. So people that are labeled mentally ill receive fewer medical services than those that are not labeled in this manner. And they're also less likely to receive the same range of insurance benefits as those without mental illness. And so several significant barriers in place. There's also the social rejection and socioeconomic impact. Those who are publicly labeled mentally ill and the stigma that comes around that, they have less income, they're more likely to be underemployed compared to even a similarly impaired but unlabeled group. And so it's that visibility of the label of being mentally ill that makes the difference. The general public, they're also more likely to not lease an apartment to those that have been labeled as mentally ill. And they're also more likely to press false charges with the police for violent crimes against those with mental illness. And so this is a very real world that stigma has contributed to. And then of course in church settings, we look at that as its own particular kind of flavor of harm of stigma. And in church settings, we see that there may be a tendency towards the focus of sin and blame, i.e. that church members are responsible for their own mental illness through the process of sin, which leads to anger and sometimes pity. And then there's kind of going back to that narrow definition of mental illness, that if it's rare, then we don't really have to deal with it, or it's just that one or two people that have it, and oh, that's a sin issue anyway. And then this internalization of stigma, this self-stigma, may lead the person to feel spiritually less than. Am I not praying enough? Am I not studying the Bible enough? What's wrong with me that I'm the one that is chosen to have a mental illness? And then that stigma leads, of course, to the marginalization. So pushing those with mental illness in the church to the side so they can't experience the fullness of church, such as leadership or being involved in small groups, and so on. Okay, and then Kristen is going to share the really good news. She gets the fun part about this.
Yeah, so a little caveat as well that I guess we maybe should have started with in the beginning is Michelle and I, our experience is in primarily Protestant Christian churches. So that's kind of the language that we might use sometimes, but certainly people like David Rossmarin have done a lot around the Jewish community. I'm not as familiar with Muslim resources or other Orthodox or Catholic resources, but if any of you have more knowledge about that, definitely feel free to add some info about that in the chat as well, especially as we discuss at the end. But so if you would kind of just take in mind some of the background language that we're using, and I think there's some applications to other faith communities as well. But ultimately, the good news is that we can change our attribution. So what Michelle was talking about our beliefs, of danger or mental illness being rare, blaming the person for their symptoms. We don't have to just say, oh, well, that's just how we have to think, and so that's what it is. We actually can play a unique role in stigma reduction because we can talk about those things and educate people in our faith communities about what's true about mental illness. Things like the NAMI statistics that help us understand just the prevalence of mental illness, and it doesn't always look like a certain thing. So the best approach is really to use multiple measures across modalities. So you might think of stigma reduction as like a social media campaign, and that might be one piece of one domain that you might want to engage in. But I really appreciate the Heinders and Vandemege model. In 2006, they laid out kind of a model for stigma reduction that involves intrapersonal, interpersonal, organizational, community, and then government and policy levels, and so that broader advocacy work. So we're going to talk through that right now to kind of think about what would that look like in each of those domains. So in the intrapersonal, that's really talking about that self-stigma, where the person within themselves has to overcome some of the internalized stigma that they're carrying around. And so that really often happens in mental health treatment. So we as counselors can help people kind of, whatever our theoretical approach, whether it's CBT or a narrative approach or a psychodynamic approach, we can empower the client to think about themselves and improve their self-concept, and even providing psychoeducation around certain aspects of mental illness that a person may not be aware of. Specifically, if they have a diagnosis, then they can learn more about what that diagnosis means, and separate themselves from that diagnosis, that the label doesn't define them. Ways that, help them understand ways that the label can be helpful, and also ways that maybe they don't need to take it on as, life defining. It's a piece of something that they are, working to overcome in their life. So that's the intrapersonal. We want to get inside people's heads and the way they're thinking about themselves. Then the interpersonal really happens in home and community-based relationships. And this is where faith communities have a built-in framework, because we have, obviously relationships, but small groups, we have, ministry teams, we have all kinds of different little clusters of people. And if a church is really aware and is attempting to reduce stigma, one of the best things to do is look for the people on the margins and really intentionally develop relationships with them. Unfortunately, a lot of times in faith communities, there's kind of like the in crowd and the out crowd, like Michelle was talking about. And really, people who can't show up on time or have, all kinds of disabilities are often on the fringes because they don't kind of fit in the natural system. If you can show up at a certain time, attend a service and remain seated and quiet the whole time, serve in a ministry team where you can participate on a schedule, all of those things in some ways just structurally create stigma because it's not accommodated, right? And so part of this interpersonal is psychoeducation, and part of it is making an accommodation. Just throw out here, Key Ministry is one example of a group. They work with churches to help them create accommodations for kids with disabilities of all different kinds. Steve Yurkevich is a psychiatrist who leads that ministry. So there's things out there where people are trying to help churches make accommodations, think about ways to be more inclusive with people who are struggling with some different challenges. I think when you educate the church community, then in those relationships, even well-meaning people can say things like, if someone says, gee, I'm dealing with anxiety, and someone may say to them, well, have you tried praying about it? You just need to trust God. It'll all be okay. Those kind of answers are something called spiritual bypass. And we say those things a lot in faith communities, trying to be nice and trying to help the person. But ultimately, it's stigmatizing because it perpetuates that message of you haven't done enough, or there's something that you're doing wrong that's creating those symptoms. And so just, building those relationships and being able to say more encouraging things like, I'm sorry you're going through that. Thanks for sharing that with me. How can I help you? So those are some of the interpersonal language things we can change. And then on an organizational level, training programs, this is where you might have, like I have a curriculum that you can see. If you go to churchtherapy.com/stigma, you'll see a link to it. And I think we have it on the last slide as well. It's designed for small groups in churches so that anybody, it's not just people who are dealing with a mental illness, but everybody can get educated on specific disorders, wrestle through things like, should Christians take medications, which I know in the evangelical Christian community is sometimes a point of contention. Some people believe that taking medications is a sign that weakness or not trusting God enough. So those are some kind of focused and specific questions. But you can, as a church, offer these training programs. You can also do things like, and we'll talk a little bit more about specific ideas, but have community groups come into your church. So NAMI or other peer support groups can come in and use your church space or offer their programs to your church. In the community, this is where I think the church can get involved and partner with the local mental health community as well to provide some education and advocacy campaigns. So, as communities, we can be a part of shifting the culture. I think when churches participate in that type of activity, it really shows that we're interested in embracing people, and that the church isn't just kind of an exclusive club. And then in terms of government and policy, I think certainly as counselors and, I think lay leaders who have a passion for this as well within the church, and do some broader advocacy to encourage new laws like mental health parity, equal rights, fair treatment and leave in the workplaces. Some of the things Michelle was talking about, rent and, policing and things like that. There's all kinds of ways that outside of the church walls, the church can come together and really participate in what's happening in the broader advocacy sphere. So there's a few evidence-based kind of, for thinking back just to that first intrapersonal, this is kind of the counselor's role. What are some ways that we can learn from treatment programs that have worked around decreasing the self-stigma? So whatever setting you work in, and counselors, honestly, if you have a faith community, it's wonderful to offer either groups or workshops that kind of borrow from some of these treatment programs. But three I'm going to talk about that are evidence-based and have been shown to decrease self-stigma. So the first one is this narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy. And it's group therapy that they did for 20 sessions. You can read more, you can see the reference there. You could do it in a church or open it up to the community. It's really offering psychoeducation about mental illness and using the concepts of cognitive restructuring around the sense of self to decrease the sense of illness identity. And it's working through the client's life story. So if you're familiar with narrative therapy and some basic cognitive restructuring, you can imagine some ideas, and you can even, look up these authors as well and see the specific way that they laid it out over 20 sessions. It's really reframing the client's life story to move away from your identity as based in illness. Another one is a self-stigma reduction program. You can see the authors there to get more information. And they had 12 group sessions followed up with 4 individual sessions using CBT and motivational interviewing. They were focused mostly on social skills and assertiveness training. And I think assertiveness is a really interesting piece of this, because when you're internalizing public stigma, what you may be doing is kind of not knowing how to advocate for yourself, or not even believing that an empowering message would be true about you. And so I think learning how to counter some of those public stigma messages is helpful. And also in this program, they talked about goal setting as well. And then a final intrapersonal treatment program is this idea of coming out proud. And it borrows ideas. It's not about the LGBTQ community, but it borrows from that idea. And they encourage this in peer groups or therapy groups, or even individually, where it's actually kind of embracing a mental illness identity. So whereas the first one was kind of shunning illness identity and talking about a more broad narrative, this one is really saying, yeah, okay, you have bipolar disorder, like, you can be proud about that, or you have ADHD, or you have depression, like, you think in a way that other people don't think. A lot of famous artists and poets and writers have had bipolar disorder or depression or anxiety. And so kind of looking at, what does it offer? What do you have to offer? And then weighing the pros and cons about disclosure of mental illness. So if you started talking about this openly with your friends and family, what would be the pros of that? And then what might be some negative outcomes of that? And then it really encourages a coming out experience to a peer group. So once you've identified who might be safe in your life to say, hey, I have bipolar disorder, or hey, I have depression, to be able to kind of have that as a moment, you start openly talking about mental illness. So those are some examples of the intrapersonal ways that as counselors we can help people with a self-stigma. Michelle is now going to talk about some ways that we can address the other areas within church settings.
All right, thanks, Kristen. That's excellent. So in the interest of time, because we really want to give you some practical applications of the theoretical, but to just briefly talk a little bit about some of the interpersonal, organizational, community, and advocacy parts of what is the church's role in stigma reduction more specifically. Why does this make sense? So first, the place of the church in the delivery of mental health care, it is not well understood. It should be. We're getting there. We're making gains on it. But churches occupy a unique position because they offer that natural spiritual counseling and guidance, and do often provide support in that non-stigmatizing way. So how do we essentially spread this a little bit further is what we're going to be talking about. And so if it's an area of interest of research for you, there's encouragement that few studies really do exist. So let's talk a little bit about how we want to move from this isolating experience like the gentleman that you see there on the right, more to that church body that you see on the left-hand side. Now, I know we're all practicing social distancing, so please don't run out and hug all your church members, not at least until June or what have you. We're going to get there. Okay, so the first piece of this that I think is very important is obviously as the head of the church, so the senior pastor or the senior minister, any church kind of mental health, anti-stigma needs to have his or her blessing in place and acknowledgement and encouragement and support. So in reality though, the history between religion and mental health, it does contain conflict, mistrust, misunderstanding, even some antagonistic feelings. And we can even, in all honesty, hold stigma within ourselves as mental health practitioners against pastors or clergy. Maybe we hold our own stereotypes, like they don't believe that mental health is important in their communities, or they don't know anything about psychology. And so just to take a moment and ask yourself that question, do I hold any inherent stigma that could be a barrier from collaborating with my local faith community? So here's the good news. While religion and psychology, we use different vocabularies and methodologies to understand human experiences, our goals really do overlap, and they're often really congruent. And so both religion and mental health services, we both seek to provide that emotional well-being to our people. And we also tend to emphasize the importance of relationships between our clients and between their parishioners. And so we understand that we are fundamentally these biopsychosocial spiritual beings, and both camps have this framework for understanding what that means in the human experience. Collaboration can help fill in the gaps. Mental health providers on our side, we are still largely unaware or unskilled of how to address the spiritual needs of our clients, not like an individual with a theology degree. Similarly, on their side, clergy are often untrained in how to address the psychological needs of their parishioners. So for this reason, that's why collaboration can kind of help fill in the gaps from both sides. So let me emphasize for a moment that this is a partnership. This is a collaboration. This is not the mental health person coming in and dropping the truth bomb about how it's going to be, how it's going to look in this particular church. So interestingly, when an individual seeks both spiritual and mental health support, increasing that collaboration between the mental health provider and the clergy member or pastor can actually serve to increase treatment adherence. So that's a really good, I think, motivator for continued collaboration. Okay, so how do we do this? So first, from our side, we need to walk into a church space being competent first in the acerbic areas. So having an understanding and a knowledge about different spiritual beliefs, even within denominations, and being able to speak their language is incredibly helpful. Just being aware of this history of conflict, of some of this antagonism and maybe mismatch of perspectives, is really important, and stepping into that space really gently, compassionately, and respectfully helps to build that trusted relationship. And it takes on our part a willingness to invest the time to foster this relationship. And I would encourage you, don't just focus on the senior leadership within the church, but also think about how you might be able to come alongside the youth minister, the care pastors, the children's minister or children's pastor, small group pastors. Take them to lunch, kind of love on them and understand what their needs are. And it's a slow process. I was in leadership in the church for probably 6 years before establishing a counseling center, and that was a time of building trust. And also, be aware that these kind of direct contact interventions or direct contact is really the key to reducing stigma and then opening that door for good mental health care. Be aware of the pastor's training in mental health. Very few get any classes on mental health. And so know what their knowledge is and then be willing to provide some psychoeducation. And then asking what's the church's DNA? Who is this church? What are they known for? Each church has a very different DNA. Is it an advantaged church? Is it a socially disadvantaged? Who's sitting in the pews? Who may need a particular type of support? Are there a number of veterans in the congregation who may need a specific kind of support? That's a great question for the pastor. And then remember that pastors often see mental health as a one-way referral street, but it does not and should not be that way. So pastors feel like oftentimes that they're just going to refer a bunch of clients to you and you're going to make some good money and you're going to be able to support some people. But it never works in the reverse, when it may be appropriate to refer the person back for additional spiritual support. And then creating practical resources. All of the pastors and clergy and ministers that I know are overwhelmed. Let's make it easy for them. Let's create a decision tree so that they know when to refer and how to refer. And then kind of a mental health protocol, and just hand that piece of paper to them in a way that makes it really easy and feasible for them to use us, essentially. Okay, Kristen is going to go on about some more practical ideas.
Yeah, and I just want to throw in here too that there's such a multicultural piece that is impossible to adequately put into this presentation, but not only kind of different denominations within Protestantism, and then obviously Catholicism and Orthodoxy, Islamic, my lack of knowledge is coming through horribly right now, but in their faith communities and Jewish synagogues and things like that, I think I'm feeling challenged even right now to increase my knowledge of some of those other religions and other kinds of faith communities, because that's part of the ACERB competencies. And so we just need to always keep that multiculturalism in mind. Also, things like the Black church in America or Hispanic churches that may tend towards sometimes more Pentecostalism or legalism. We need to just really get to know, like Michelle said, the church's DNA, and not just think of the faith community as whatever we're already familiar with, but really challenging ourselves to look at our communities as a whole in all their diversity, and think about ways to develop relationships across all those cultural lines. So that's just kind of a little piece I'm going to throw in, but some practical ideas. I have offered mental health care services, as has Michelle, right in the church setting. So kind of embedding a practice, kind of as we can borrow from things like wraparound care and milieu settings to kind of understand how to think about what this looks like. You can go to churchtherapy.com and read more about my approach. You can run a small group or educational class, a workshop at a church. You can train their small group leaders on the basics of mental health awareness. So go in and do like a mental health 101 or a psychological first aid training for their small group leaders. You can host a mental health awareness Sunday, which Michelle has done, and I know some other churches near me have done. You can preach or encourage the pastor to speak from the pulpit about theology and mental illness. I've collaborated with our pastor on sermons that tie in some information about mental illness, so that he doesn't speak about depression or anxiety in ways that make them different as if they're not illnesses. So we're careful around the language that comes out of the pulpit on that. Partnering with NAMI and support groups, offering church space. A lot of times churches have empty rooms or spaces where mental health support groups can come in and use that space. Then that builds a relationship. You can help conduct a social media campaign or give out information in the church. Sometimes churches will have a guest come and set up a table and hand out some flyers or something like that to just provide more information. And then connecting with others who are passionate about mental health in the church. I've connected with a lot of people on Twitter, and so we get ideas from each other and are encouraged by what we're all doing around the country. As I mentioned, Church Therapy Associates is my nonprofit, and that's where I'm training master's level counseling students to do internships in church settings to understand how to develop relationships with pastors, and really a focus on serving clients who are specifically seeking to work with a Christian counselor. A lot of times, at least in the evangelical Christian community, Christians don't want to seek mental health treatment unless the counselor is themselves a Christian. So there's a desire for a shared kind of cultural match there. So that's what I do. And Michelle, do you want to talk really briefly about your Mental Health Sunday and what that looked like?
Sure, and the video and resources around Mental Health Sunday will be added to our resource page, so you're welcome to take a look at that. Essentially, on a yearly basis, the senior pastor asked myself and another counselor to come up on stage and do kind of a mini sermon or mini psychoeducational, as I would put it, on a Sunday to the congregation. And this was an amazing experience and opportunity to do so. And what came out of that was this idea of we are going to talk about mental illness in the church, and we're going to talk about it in a non-stigmatizing manner. And it was pretty amazing to me, the amount of people that reached out right after Mental Health Sunday, the times that we did it, and said, I'm so glad that we are talking about this because I have a mental illness and I've never been to a church that talks about it so openly and is beginning to remove the stigma that's around that. And I feel more comfortable coming back to this church. And so it was incredibly powerful and effective. And so those resources are there should you choose to utilize them. Just let me know. And let me put the address of where these resources are going to be in the chat box again. It's the churchtherapy.com stigma. And so, Kristen, if you want to talk through just a little bit more of the resources, we're doing good on time. It's about 1:47, and so we got a little bit of time for questions afterwards.
Yeah, we're going to really open it up for discussion. So these are the things that you're going to find on that page. There are email addresses if you want to jot those down. We're happy to hear from you as well. If you have specific questions or want to reach out, but churchtherapy.com is my blog. Michelle has her example videos and outlines, which we'll put on that page shortly, and also her presentation for small group leaders. We have an idea sheet that you can print out, and that kind of goes through the Hinders and Vandemage model that we went through today of all those different domains where you can think about in your setting what would make the most sense for each of those areas. I also, as I mentioned, have written the small group curriculum, and so if you go to tinyurl.com/churchmh, you will link to Amazon, and you can see the books that I have there. And our references, a broader bibliography is also on that page that Michelle typed into the chat. So that's our info. And then we just really wanted to open it up in this last 8 to 10 minutes or so and really hear your ideas. Is this stimulating any thoughts for you? Have you done similar things? And kind of, you know, any of these questions that you see on the screen, we won't go through them kind of one by one. Just, you know, has this been challenging for you? What are the ways that you feel like you could connect with churches or faith communities where you live? Is there any specific things that you want to do to follow up? So I'm going to minimize my screen here, and maybe I'll be able to see the chat. I might have to stop sharing to see the chat, so I think that's what I'm going to do. Now I can see it. Yeah, I'll stop talking now, and if you guys want to jump in, put your microphone and video on and just tell us what your thoughts are, that would be awesome. Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. Here, let me go ahead and share my screen again. Michelle, you'll have to maybe read out loud anything that is posted in the chat since I won't see it.
Yep, absolutely. So just sharing the contact information again. And thank you. Oh, my chat box just went away. I love technology when it works well.
Oh, is that because I'm sharing my screen? Do I
nope, we're good.
Here? Okay.
We're good. We just had a really nice comment. let's see, Constance said it just made her think more about the connection between the Black church community and the counselor. And yes, Kristen and I were just talking a little bit about this, about how the Black churches that we're aware of tend to be a little bit more in the forefront of especially trauma-informed care, trauma-informed churches. That's a fairly new concept that some research is coming out on. But so, you know, there may be some opportunities for openness there that you may not find with other churches. So absolutely important for that. And then let me just read through here real quick. Jessica, thank you. I'm glad this was helpful. Yeah, grief support groups, there are quite a few excellent ones that are already up and going that are either run by lay people or by counselors. So that is, grief support is an excellent way to host a group within a church. And it's interesting that churches seem to be more responsive to that type of mental health support through grief than maybe others. So it's a really neat way to be able to establish a presence there.
Yeah, and I want to add to that Saddleback Church, Rick Warren and Kay Warren run out in California. Yeah, their son had bipolar disorder and he committed suicide several years ago. Their church has put out resources. One is Grief Share. So it's like a curriculum for a grief group. They also have Celebrate Recovery, which is an addiction support group curriculum. And they also have divorce care. So those are ways that churches may already have heard of some resources, and you as a counselor could come in and say, hey, why don't I run this? Or maybe that's, you know, the church you attend, and so as kind of your ministry, you just want to lead some of those things. So there's definitely resources that exist that pastors may already trust because it's from maybe names that they have heard of. Anybody else want to jump in on the video or microphone, turn on and tell us what your thoughts are?
Kristen, we did have one question about the slides being made available to folks, and I think we would be happy to put them up on the.
They're already on the thing. So if you go to churchtherapy.com/stigma, the slides are there, the bibliography is there, the idea sheet is there, and the link to my small group curriculum is there. And Michelle's stuff will be added later on today.
Perfect. Well, we are just a few minutes ahead of our time. So I think as a children's pastor used to say to me, sharing is caring. So as much as we can possibly support and share resources with you, because the idea is that after this presentation, we want this to be kind of a long tail of effectiveness for you. And so we definitely encourage you to take a look at the resources that we have put together. Don't reinvent the wheel. And if you have questions or just kind of want somebody to come alongside of you in this, I know Kristen is available. I'm available.
Yeah.
But, yeah, so we did have, oh yeah, there's some good resources. Folks are sharing some good resources.
Oh, good. Okay, and this is being recorded and all the chats will be recorded too, so that'll be great.
Yeah. Yeah, oh, this is a great idea about local mental health professionals offering to write articles about coping with the isolation of the pandemic, and the pastors were really open to that. That's a great idea. And there have been studies that talk a little bit about how media can be a really powerful anti-stigmatization tool. And so as we write articles, maybe even as we host artwork by people that are mentally ill in our church, reflecting their experiences, like let's think about how we can use media for a really powerful tool.
Yeah, that's great. If anyone has any other resources as well on other types of faith communities, please throw that in the chat before we run out of time, because that would be really great learning for us as well. Like I said, David Rosemarin is, he works at McLean and also has a center in New York. I think it's called the Center for Anxiety in New York, and he is active in research and also in the Jewish community. So he established a spiritual institute, or Institute for Spirituality, at McLean Hospital here in the Boston area. But I know he has some good resources on the Jewish community as well. Thanks so much for coming, guys. I think we're just about out of time, and I know there's another group that'll come in and use the space. But if you have any last thoughts or questions or comments, definitely throw them in the chat.